So at this point, I think we have to believe this virus is respiratory. Maybe fomites too.
What's that? Fomites?
It refers to transmission from surfaces. The average person touches their face 2 or 3,000 times a day,
2 or 3 thousand times a day.
3 to 5 times every waking minute. In between, we're touching doors, water fountains, elevator buttons, and each other. Those things become fomites.
Is this something we want to release to the press? Respiratory and fomites? How's the public going to react to that?
Well, it's hard to say. Plastic shark in a movie will keep you from getting into the ocean, but a warning on the side of a pack of cigarettes won't stop you from buying it.
Oh, we're going to need to walk government through this before we start to freak everybody out. I mean, we can't tell people right now what they should be afraid of. We tried that with swine flu, and all we did was get healthy people scared. It's the biggest shopping weekend of the year.
I think we need to consider closing schools down.
And who stays at home with the kids? Who works in stores? Government workers, people who work in hospitals. When will we know what this is? What causes it? What cures it? Things to keep people calm.
What we need to determine is this. For every person who gets sick, how many other people are they likely to infect? So for the seasonal flu, that's usually about 1. Smallpox, on the other hand, it's over 3. Now, before we had a vaccine, polio spread at a rate of between 4 and 6.
Any ideas what that might be for this?
How fast it multiplies depends on a variety of factors. The incubation period, how long a person is contagious. Sometimes people can be contagious without even having symptoms. You need to know that too. And we need to know how big the population of people susceptible to the virus might be.
So far, that appears to be everyone with hands, a mouth, and a nose.
Welcome to It's About Nothing. Welcome back, Ken, to 2021. You survived without contracting COVID-19. I can see that.
I did.
Well done.
Yes.
Quite the achievement.
It is an achievement. I think that's the thing with 2020. Just to survive it, to get through it was an achievement.
So that script was not taken from a leaked tape from a government meeting last year. It was actually from a 2011 film, Contagion.
Yeah, I'm still getting my head around fomites.
That's right. Well, we were both going to say fomites because it's spelt F-O-M-I-T-S. Sorry, I-T-E-S.
Yes.
So we could quite easily have aggravated a very niche audience of scientists or fans of Contagion.
Yeah. You don't think it's one of those US English versus UK English pronunciation things?
Well, it could be. That was actually, at least the script that I was reading from was Kate Winslet, who's British. So you might give her the benefit of the doubt that she is pronouncing it correctly. But then again, fomites wouldn't be. I don't think you would rush to use that as your go-to pronunciation, would you? You would, you wouldn't look at that word and say that's how it's said.
Fomites, like termites.
Yes, exactly. That's right. That's a good question. We'd rather have COVID-19 everywhere or just termites everywhere? What would happen if there were just termites in every building? Could that be almost as bad?
I'm sitting at a desk made of wood, so I suppose there are termites everywhere. And like most people's houses, it's not a wooden house per se, but there's wooden frames and stuff like that. So if we truly had a global termite pandemic infestation, I think that would present a lot of problems as well.
Well, a lot of people watched Contagion last year, and I know that because it shows up as a frequently viewed movie on Netflix. So
yeah.
It's probably for obvious reasons, but isn't it interesting that whilst we had plenty of news and discussions about viruses last year, that people thought that the best way to wind down at the end of the day of hearing all of that was to sit down and watch a movie about a virus that basically sweeps through the planet.
Yeah, I found that weird. I think I was saying to you before, I couldn't bring myself to watch it last year We're actually at the moment watching, like, there's a new adaptation of the Stand, the old like Stephen King book, and I think last year probably I wouldn't have wanted to watch that, to be honest with you. And I had wondered last year whether our appetite for kind of disaster movies, or especially those apocalyptic sort of movies, might wane a little bit. But no, I think people are still fascinated by that kind of content.
Yeah, you're right. In fact, I started watching The Stand as well. And I read the book many years ago, the Stephen King book, and saw the old miniseries as well. And I was just thinking that is either like an incredible timing to have a miniseries about another virus that wipes out the planet, arriving on your doorstep just at the tail end of the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I imagine that they started planning this well before the COVID-19 hit.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they did. Yeah, it's even like Stephen King was in the media, this time last year or just after it, when COVID was, first becoming really big, and he said this is not The Stand, like speculating like where it was going. It's funny when you watch a movie like that, even Contagion. I mean, it's a flippant thing to say, but it makes you think, well, COVID's not that bad in a way, because in those movies, when people get sick, everybody gets really, really sick really quickly. And it's kind of like, I think they even say in The Stand, 6 months ago, we were worried about Ebola. Like, this thing is way worse than Ebola. So it's truly, as we know, COVID has a relatively low mortality rate amongst those who are affected. But in these sort of movies, the mortality rate's very, very high. And you are looking at a complete breakdown of society within a few weeks.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of people were saying last year that we might look back at this time as being like actually really beneficial, simply because whilst as horrific as the whole thing's been for everyone, especially in those countries where it's just kind of gone out of control, it could have been a lot worse, and it's a kind of like a dress rehearsal for something a lot worse, and to get us a mindset on the right what could happen, and getting the systems in place and the protocols.
Yeah, that's one thing that's really scary about it in a way. Like, it shows how badly prepared we are in some ways, and we've done really well here in Australia, like compared to a lot of other countries. But to be honest with you, I assumed the US would have had the sort of pandemic plan in the top drawer, kind of ready to go, and whether they did or they didn't, or it was partly the Trump administration's kind of ineptitude. I guess all those details will probably come out in years from now, but they haven't responded to it nearly as well as we thought they might have. And I mean, someone made an interesting point to me the other day and said, if the US was subject to biological warfare, like, from another country, and I'm not saying that that's what this is, they'd actually be quite unprepared for it. Like, that, it's run pretty rampant, and the same in Europe and other places as well. So yeah, like, I'm always mindful in Australia where things are a lot better here than they are, in some other parts of the world.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing I saw yesterday actually was that it seems to have really taken off in the UK.
Oh yeah, it has.
It's actually worse than the US, the UK.
Yeah, and what part of that is, like, there's a different strain, although which is more contagious, not necessarily more lethal, but more contagious. But that strain, I think, is also in the US now, and there's also a South African strain and a Brazilian strain, and my understanding is that it's normal for viruses to mutate. Obviously, as they go along, they don't necessarily strengthen; they often weaken. But they, in this case, it seems to be becoming more contagious. So the UK is really struggling.
Yeah, well, I think we've all, depending on our nature and the timing of all of this, we've all kind of had either a bit of a pessimistic outlook or more of an optimistic one. And I think it's probably normal to sort of teeter between both of those things. But if I were to look at, I think when this whole thing started, in sort of February, March last year, at least, when society became more cognizant of what was happening, I certainly would thought, oh, this will kind of blow over in a few months. You know, it'll be sorted out. And then the other extreme, you had people saying it would be much, much worse than what's ended up happening, which is catastrophic outcomes. And it hasn't actually been either of those extremes lately. I mean, you could argue it's catastrophic, but it could have been, strangely enough, it could have been more catastrophic. It's a bit like saying, you know, you drop one nuclear warhead, and that's catastrophic, but you could always drop 10, you know, so it's...
Yeah. Like predictions are, I guess, a dangerous game at the best of times. But I noticed, like, you know, around Christmas or just before Christmas, there was that bit of a blow up in Sydney, and then that sort of like popped up in a few other places as well. And there was some, I know, like Norman Swan, you know, who's a medical commentator at the ABC, got a lot of flack in some quarters because he sort of predicted, if you don't get on top of this now, you'll have, and he sort of put out some rolling numbers, I think, on social media, and then those numbers didn't come to fruition, thankfully. And so he was kind of called out on that. So there has been a range of prediction over the last 12 months, and it's probably a good reminder. You've got to be careful sticking your neck out with that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think so. You're right, because it's so difficult if you're in that field, or if you're in a medical field and people are looking to you for advice, because if you predict that it's going to go really badly and it doesn't, then people it's kind of like the boy who cried wolf.
Yeah.
People then don't listen to you the next time you say there could be a problem.
Yeah.
But then if you don't make those predictions and you're less conservative and things break out, then you're in a worse situation where they say, gee, well, you know, you've really downplayed the risk here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't actually envy a lot of the we've discussed this before. I don't envy the leaders or the chief medical officers or anyone, because I just think that you're basically damned if you do, regardless of what action you take.
Yeah.
And yeah, certainly I think we had our very first podcast was about almost how impossible it is to predict the future. It's something we have to do all the time.
Yeah.
We're not very good at doing it unless it's something that we can set our watch by. Like, we know that the sun is going to rise and set every day.
Yeah. It's very hard when planning. Like, I was listening to something yesterday about the Tokyo Olympics, and, you know, they already got delayed from last year. So they're now meant to happen in June, I think it is. And the new Japanese Prime Minister made a statement and said, these Olympics will be a triumph over COVID. So in some ways, that's a sort of an emotional response to it, saying we're going to show the world, you know, that we can do this. But the COVID situation in Japan, unfortunately, is worse now than it was, you know, when they postponed the original games. So it's how you plan major events and things like that in those circumstances it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, my sort of take on last year and what was happening with COVID is, in retrospect, which is always useful, you know, the hindsight, is that no one really knew what the hell was going on or what they were doing, because it's like every country, I mean, even like the term flatten the curve, which was very popular at the start. Yes. I haven't heard that at all. And it seems to me that was never really, that just really didn't work that much. And it seems, you know, you can certainly flatten it, but if you don't sort of stomp it out completely, then it's just going to shoot right back up again. It seems like an odd strategy in hindsight.
I think there's been, you know, maybe some confusion or even some, I don't want to use the word dishonesty, but like lack of transparency over different governments and authorities' real strategy on this, because very few of them have said openly they're going for elimination. And yet in some circumstances, it seems like that's the policy they're pursuing. But then you can't really go for elimination in one state and then not go for elimination in another state, I guess, unless you're going to take the closed border thing really, really seriously. And I mean, as a slight segue, one of the things that really surprised me about last year was I'd never really thought of Australia as a place where the borders between states mattered all that much. You know, I've lived in Melbourne and Canberra and in Sydney for a little while, a long time ago. And yeah, the borders here have always seemed pretty arbitrary to me. And so the fact, and I can even remember early on when they were talking about closing state borders, I thought, no, I don't think that'll happen. I just don't I just don't see that as a reality. And I was completely wrong about that. Not only have they been closed, but they've opened and in some cases reclosed. And most governments have indicated that they, kind of reserve the right to keep doing that, possibly even after vaccine rollout.
Yeah, absolutely. Last year were full of surprises. As we discussed, we've got a few little questions I thought that you and I can answer as to kind of summarize the year. I'm interested to know what you think, and no doubt you'll be maybe surprised or not surprised by what I think. So this is kind of like 5 questions to summarize 2020.
Yeah.
All right. So I'll start with the first one. I know language and the use of language is often a bit of a pet peeve of yours. I know you don't like the word. Let me try and remember. There's one particular phrase or word that you can't stand. It'll come to me later. But
there's a whole bunch of them. We could probably do the rest of the podcast. Words and expressions Cam doesn't like, but we might leave that for another episode.
Yes, true. Well, no, my parents have got a big pet peeve against a word that doesn't actually exist, that's used all the time, agreeance.
Agreeance?
Yes, instead of agreements.
Instead of agreement.
We've reached agreements as opposed to we've reached agreements.
I really dislike the word learnings.
Oh, that's the one.
Is that the one you were thinking of? Yeah.
I hate that one as well. I often strike it out and put down knowledge. I think that's kind of
knowledge or lesson even. It just depends. But
it depends on what it is. Yeah.
Really, and I dislike the way it's seeped into the vernacular in the last couple of years. I'll probably end it there because I'll just keep going and going with it.
So in 2020, what is the most annoying phrase or new term that came out of 2020?
COVID normal.
I can't believe this. We have actually landed on an exact.
Is it really? Okay, you tell me why you hate it, and then I'll tell you why I hate it.
All right. Well, that's really interesting because I really thought that I was the only one that actually. I hadn't actually even told anyone that.
Yeah, and just for transparency, we swear to everyone listening, we have not been in cahoots on this one. We haven't. We both knew there were questions. Obviously, Nick prepared some questions for this. We haven't compared answers or anything like that, which probably goes to show how little preparation we put into this going forward.
Yeah. Well. First of all, the first time it annoyed me wasn't so much when it was said in sort of the government speech. It was when people started adopting it in normal language when you see it on social media. And I don't like catchphrases that politicians use being picked up by other people. So I also don't like phrases like just, stop the boats and then seeing people walk around saying stop the boats or saying it on social media, because it feels like they've been manipulated into saying it.
They're slogans, aren't they? And I guess the risk is, like, if people start speaking in slogans, you think they're thinking in slogans as well,
But the reason I don't like that particular one is, first of all, I think it's it's an oxymoron.
Yeah, absolutely. You can either be normal or you can be COVID.
Yes.
Yeah.
The idea of inventing this new thing, which is like a hybrid between abnormal and normal. It's like saying abnormal normal, and it just doesn't. It doesn't. And certainly, like, would we feel comfortable saying something like Ebola normal? I'll just. It just.
No, that's right, and it's not clear even what our sort of desired endpoint is, in a way, because it's saying, well, we're going through this stage of restrictions and everything at the moment, all of which I'm not questioning the need for masks and all that sort of stuff. I completely support that, but then we're working towards a normal, but it's like COVID normal. So what does that mean? And in a way, I'm not critical of them not knowing what that means, because we're all sort of working this out as we go along. But it's, I guess, you might be able to speak to your psychologist hat on, but it's you need to give people something to hope for, I suppose, don't you? So people want normal.
Yes. you're saying as well, I think what you're getting to is that there's subtext to it, which is it bugs me. It's saying it's a message that's telling you one thing, but it's also saying something else. It's basically saying, oh, by the way, with some good news here, where everything's moving towards being normal, but there's like a killer lurking in the shadows. Implied threat. There's an implied threat there.
I haven't looked into where it emerged from, but I can only assume that it's media speak, or like media advisor speak. I don't know whether it was even the Victorian government that sort of first came up with it, but that's where that's the context. I remember hearing it, like that long period of lockdown. And it's interesting, Christmas was a really big psychological thing, like a goal in a way, like having a normal Christmas, or at least a COVID normal Christmas. And that's why I think Victoria thankfully got to this point by really October and going into November, where things were much, much better. They, had all those double donut days, and then Christmas was looming on the horizon. And then just before Christmas, things started getting a little bit rocky again. But that concept of normalcy, COVID normalcy. Now, I think the vaccine, it's interesting how that works in that context, because we've all been holding out for vaccine, and vaccine has been developed a lot quicker than I think most of us would have expected when we were having this conversation at the start of 2020. But we're starting to realize that vaccine's not necessarily a silver bullet. So perhaps I thought maybe vaccine would take, 2 years to sort of, or even longer to be developed, but that when we got it, that would sort of be it and rub it out. And we're learning that there's a lot more complexity around that. And that's all part of what COVID normal is, I suppose.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think no one really knows what's going to happen with the vaccine. I think we're almost at the next stage. When COVID first came out, no one really knew what was happening. There was a bit of confusion. I think there's probably a bit of confusion around that as well. Like there's lots of questions like, if it gets rolled, how fast can it get rolled out as one? Like it may take a good 12 months before it actually has any impact.
Yeah.
And then what happens when you have it? Do you still get COVID or not? Do you get it and just recover immediately? Are you not susceptible to it? Can you still get it? It sounds like you still can. And will it work for all the mutated versions of it as well? All of these sort of questions.
How often will you have to have it? Like, will it become like a flu shot?
Yes.
Which, many people have the flu shot, not everybody does. So I think it'll be, if not mandatory, that you'll find that it's much more difficult to conduct normal life without having it, once it's, freely accessible to everybody. And I think I talked about this like way back early last year, like there's going to be many vaccines. So already seeing that there's like, a number available to us in Australia. I think we've signed up more heavily to AstraZeneca, but, China's got one that they're rolling out to different parts of the world. And Russia's got one that they rolled out very quickly that Vladimir Putin's daughter took, apparently. I don't know how successful that is, but a lot of questions around it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's quite interesting that maybe it was always inevitable, but obviously COVID's become so political, when you wouldn't think that something about health and something like that would be as easy to make so political. And what I mean by that is that it's kind of like there's artifacts that you can either agree to or disagree with that kind of put you in different camps. And so one of them is, the obvious one was the face mask wearing thing. It's like, there are people in the camp of like, it's restrictions on our freedom and they're dangerous to wear masks. And there's the others who are like, no, it's almost like a symbol of being cautious and listening to science. And you get these two camps forming. And then the vaccine, there's these two camps forming as well of people who are very much, worried about taking it. It's been rushed. What kind of implications does it have in the long term? And then the others, again, it's like, science says the science says it's safe, and we've got to listen to the science, and it's better than having the virus spread around. Yeah. And I feel like the flavour of last year has been there's probably the sensible middle ground, which you don't hear a lot from in social media and in conversation. Well, I think in conversation you hear it more, which is, well, you know what? There are situations where you do listen to the science, but you have to also be critical of things. You have to look and say to yourself, oh, I'll be convinced by the data, and I'll be convinced by the science, and I'll take it. And I think that's sensible. I think that having this sort of almost make up your mind before you even know, either way is the thing that we've got to kind of stomp out. It's not thinking things through. And that's my stance on vaccines, is that I'll definitely take it if they're saying they've done all the tests and they're saying it's safe. But I'm not going to go in not knowing anything about it and just blindly take it either. I'd like to know a little bit more, because they might tell you things that are quite important, like side effects and things that you might experience, and maybe there'll be options. To your point, there might be options of different vaccines you could take.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah.
All right. Why don't we move on to the next question? So this is what you think was the most talked about thing last year. So in 2020, what do you think was the most talked about thing last year?
Hazard a guess. I wanted to say it was the AFL, and whether the season would it be on, would it not be on, and then it turned out to be this weird sort of hybrid season. But that's I'm not even in Melbourne anymore, but that's at the moment, but that's a very Melburnian perspective, I suppose. I don't want it to be COVID, right? But can you give me something else? What else are we talking about?
Well, I was desperately stretching to find this thing to surprise you.
Yeah.
And I had there were two options available. One of them was Donald Trump, and the second one being COVID. But then it occurred to me that even Trump was talking about COVID. So if everyone's talking about Trump, then they were probably talking about him as well as COVID anyway. So I think, that's unfortunately, if we do this podcast in a year from now and do 2021, there might be some other thing that
Yeah, I mean, it was COVID, obviously, but there were so many subsets to COVID and ways we were responding to it. I mean, do you remember early on people were saying a lot, we're all in this together?
Mm-hmm.
And it was even sort of on Instagram, I think early on, there were kind of celebrities, in big compounds in Malibu and stuff like that, sort of doing shout outs to people and stuff and saying we're all in this together. But it turned out very quickly, we're not all in this together. We all have different situations and different, advantages and disadvantages. And in some ways, some really, really encouraging things have come out of COVID, some examples of community solidarity and all that sort of stuff. But unfortunately, it's also shown a lot of differences and fractures in society, be that, state governments putting up borders against each other, conversations we were having last year about working from home and how all that works. So, 'cause that's reality for a lot of people, me included, but then a lot of other people don't have that experience, and that, what work's essential or what isn't essential, economic haves and have-nots, all that sort of thing. So for me, a lot of the conversation last year was about points of difference.
Yeah, do you know what I think is interesting as well is that last year was such an interesting one in that if you put the COVID-19 aside, there were big events that were occurring besides that. So we had the election, the US election, which was it will probably go down in our lifetime as the most memorable election of all time. I can't imagine anything ever topping that. That was absolutely amazing what was going on.
Yeah.
And of course, all the riots and protests and things that were occurring overseas.
Yeah.
You could almost put the recent what is it called again? The storming of Capitol Hill. You could have almost put that into the camp, but of course that happened this year. But whether it's a byproduct of last year, but there was all of this really insane stuff happening last year, and we could quite easily have said, what was the most talked about thing last year? Black Lives Matter or something. That could have easily.
Oh, absolutely. That's a really good point. So if COVID wasn't there, I think BLM would have been, I mean, it was big, obviously, but it would have been seen as sort of definitely the biggest thing happening in the US, tied up with the election and a sense of social change. And in some ways, like, we talk about like the year 1968, for example, being a really big year in sort of American politics and world politics, like 2019, 2020 sort of had a similar flavor to it. There was a lot of stuff going on internationally as well, sort of in geopolitics. So tensions between China and the US, sort of like, trade war and strategic tensions, and also the relationship between Australia and China, like, has just deteriorated an enormous amount during 2020, but didn't really make the news until we found out, like, China wasn't buying Australian lobsters and things like that. Suddenly it like smacked people in the face if they weren't really paying close attention to it. And for those of us, who do, it was like, well, yeah, where have you been? Like, this is like the slide that we've been looking at for the last couple of years. So there was definitely a lot going on besides COVID.
What's your view then on? I don't know enough about this, but if for whatever reason, if things deteriorated even further with China, and let's say you didn't have them as an option as a trading partner, would Australia, obviously they're our key trading partner, but could Australia basically adapt by just trading with everyone else a lot more?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's sort of segmented. So there's some commodities and areas where China can turn off the tap to us very, very easily, and that's essentially what they've been doing. So things like, wine and lobster and barley, and, I don't want to be flippant, like, they're big industries, like, individually in Australia, and there's certainly people hurting, but they can do that without hurting themselves. Whereas, and even coal to some extent, but other things like iron ore, for example, China can't stop buying iron ore, Australian iron ore, without really, really hurting itself. So it seems more likely it won't be a sort of black and white thing where, all trade with China will end, but like different segments, different sections of the economy will evolve. And we'd already been talking about, there's this diversification idea where Australia's like looking for new markets to sell our goods to, and that's certainly happening in many, many areas. But there's no single market or even combination of markets that can sort of just suddenly fill the void that China's leaving in some of those areas. So China will continue to be a very, very important trade partner for Australia a long way into the future. I've got no doubt about that. But it will definitely evolve. It already is evolving, and I think we'll certainly try to become less dependent on them in certain key areas. Yeah.
Yeah, I often wondered that there must be grumblings about just gradually like weaning yourself off. Just over time, you can't just cut it off immediately, but just as a contingency that you can't always, having all your eggs in one basket always is a bit worrying, especially.
Well, one area I know a little bit about from my time in the university sector is obviously international students, and that's kind of been like a bit like a slow train wreck, or watching something happen. And it goes back before COVID, and there's just been huge demand from China for Australian universities and tertiary institutions, and obviously we've looked to fill that demand. But whether we've been lazy in developing other markets, or we're focused on China, but that's where we've been quite dependent. And the political tensions I was talking about predate COVID, and even in 2018, 2019, I know we were concerned about China sort of either turning off that tap or slowing down the flow of students coming out of China. And most big Australian universities have been actively looking for other markets. And the simple truth is you can't just go to India and hope that India will suddenly like fill all the placements that China would fill. And and COVID on top of it, Australia's sort of finding at the moment that because we're not offering in classroom experience as much as European and American universities, they're actually sort of turning away from Australia. So that's going to be a big story unfolding.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Like, and I was just thinking with all the things you mentioned, it's kind of like even in like a relationship or even a friendship or something, throwing in stresses or things that really disrupt the norm is the real test of a relationship. And it seems that That's exactly what's happened here. Like as to your point, the borders get thrown up between states. We've always had, a bit of rivalry between states and a little bit of tension, but the situation actually pitted all these states up against each other, and all of a sudden we discovered they weren't on as good a terms as you would hope for one country, right? That all the different premiers basically wanting to do their own thing and being quite adversarial towards each other. Quite
I like that stress test idea. Like with a relationship, I think fairly early on in the dating scenario, I think you should go on a trip together. Obviously not the first or second date, but if you've been dating for a while and you're looking to move to the next level, you can work out a lot about a person by the way they travel, whether it's sort of holiday or other kind of travel. Because normally, if you're going to have major problems with somebody, I think it usually manifests itself.
Flushes them out. Yeah. Yeah, as George Costanza from Seinfeld said, the weekends away are relationship killers.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and like Jerry he takes the girl away early on at one point because he thinks it accelerates.
That's right.
The intimacy level in a relationship. Like
jump a few levels. You move ahead in the relationship.
The problem is like you might jump to a few levels and find yourself somewhere you don't necessarily want to be. But I guess it makes all things clear.
Yeah, definitely. I think, isn't that always, it's kind of like, I think you're right. If you go away on a holiday or even move in with someone, I think you're peeling back the layers, aren't you, to find what happens behind the scenes. It's a bit like, what do they say? You don't want to know how the sausage is made.
In fact, this sort of, not to go back to COVID, but I know like COVID obviously had impact on relationships, right? It had an impact on so many things. And I have heard anecdotally, stories of people who basically ended up moving in together maybe a lot faster than they would have done otherwise, or maybe they never would have done otherwise. So in some cases, it's sort of, if people wanted to spend time together because of the lockdown, their choice was either not to spend any time together or spend all their time together. So in some cases, it put people together really quickly in that way. And I don't want to talk about my friends in the podcast, but I have heard one case where it worked out really, really well. But I've heard other cases sort of at a distance where it hasn't worked out so well. And of course, there's been people who they might have started dating, but then suddenly like a relationship with someone in the next suburb became a long distance relationship. So that would put, all the stresses on that. So I'm sure in the next year or two, we'll see some really great studies.
Oh, we'll have studies coming out of our
forever, no doubt.
For the next 10 years.
Yeah.
On this. Let's move on to the next question. This is a vital one. What was the best movie you saw in 2020?
Yeah, I saw very few new movies in 2020 . So from memory,
it doesn't have to be a new one.
What's that? It doesn't have to be a new one.
No. You could see Jurassic Park for the first time if you like.
You saw Jurassic Park for the first time?
No. I said you could.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I only saw two movies at the cinema. It was like Tenet and The Gentleman.
Yep.
I think I like Tenet actually, but The Gentleman was probably my favorite. And then in terms of the best movie I saw, okay, this is weird, but it was actually a really old movie that I'd never seen before called Harvey. That I rewatched it really at the very end of 2020 actually, but I've gone back and watched a lot of old movies. I like old movies, and I watched a lot of Hitchcock movies, including most I probably had seen before, but some I hadn't, and all those classic ones like Dial M for Murder and Vertigo and that sort of thing. And then Jimmy Stewart is in a lot of Alfred Hitchcock movies, so I sort of started getting into this Jimmy Stewart guy, this actor, and he made this movie. I think it's sort of in the late 40s, called Harvey, and it's about a man. It's not Alfred Hitchcock, by the way. I'm not sure who the director is. It's about a man who his best friend is an imaginary rabbit, and only he can see the rabbit. The rabbit's name is Harvey, and his sister is like really concerned about this. Brother's obviously crazy. He's walking around, going to the bar with Harvey, talking to Harvey. Harvey seems to be a pretty good influence on him, by the way, though. Like, he's a courteous man, and he's always introducing Harvey to people. They drink a little bit, but nothing bad. And his sister tries to have him committed to sort of a mental hospital because she's convinced Harvey's, that he's crazy. But then in a sort of bizarre mix-up, she ends up getting committed to the mental institution instead. And it turns out that she actually thinks she can occasionally see Harvey as well. And then as this guy is like talking to all these people about Harvey, like he just softens them all up. And by the end of it, the main sort of treating psychiatrist asks him if Harvey can be his friend instead.
You just spoiled it for me, by the way.
Yeah, I have. I'm sorry. No, you should still watch it. It's a really lovely.
It's Jimmy Stewart, right? And when was it made?
Jimmy Stewart. Yeah.
When was this made?
In
what, 70s or something? 60s?
No, it's really old. It's like I'd say it was made between 1945 and 1955. It was like
really. That sounds like a very. Yeah, it sounds like almost like a modern film. Like we just.
Yeah, it could be. Whether they could remake it. It'd be different now. Like it takes a much more sort of innocent and gentle look at mental illness, and it's strange in a way because it sort of alludes to some pretty nasty things going on in the asylum.
Mm-hmm.
Like it doesn't really show you, but you can tell the subtext is that in those days the asylum mental institution was a place. No one wanted to go because the attendants there would handle you pretty roughly, and there was different kinds of treatments, electroshock, all that sort of thing. So that's the subtext to it as well. And I mean, without spoiling, I guess I'm spoiling a little bit, but at one point he's given a choice basically of he can take a medication and he'll never see Harvey again.
Mm-hmm.
But then also the fallout from medication would be that he just won't be himself anymore.
Yes.
So there's that sort of, so all his compassion and his empathy and all those things that make him this really lovely guy are sort of wrapped up in his visualization of Harvey as well.
Yeah, it's very like a Jungian sort of view of nature. It's like you've got the yin and yang, and the dark part of you is like basically intertwined with the light side, and that forms the whole. So the theory is if you extract the darker part out, you're actually removing the whole as well. And I think that's kind of I suppose the human condition, isn't it?
I love that analysis. I'd love to see you write like
a review of it,
like a psychological treatment of Harvey, because whether that's been done or not before, I don't know, but it certainly deserves it. It sort of got me to thinking too about what we consider to be crazy and not crazy, and what we consider to be normal and abnormal behavior, and the whole idea of eccentricity. And like I remember growing up as a little kid, like hearing stories about one of my great aunts who apparently used to let her cat like sit on top of her head like a turban or a hat, and that was just considered to be that was what she did. That was okay. But whether that would be, I think in some ways we have less tolerance for people's behaviour.
Well, yeah, we do. And in some ways we're better off in a way, because I think there have been topics like anxiety and depression, things like that, which used to be sort of pushed under the surface and you have to deal with it in the asylum, perhaps. And whereas today people talk about their mental health a lot more. So it's become like more recognised that, hey, you know what, everyone has emotional issues. It's not you're actually not sick if you've got extreme emotions from time to time, or even if you experience anxiety every day, because basically that's every animal is basically, it has a little bit of vigilance going on all the time. You just have to look at a rabbit hopping around, knowing that poor rabbit spends a lot of its time a little bit worried that some creature's going to come around and gobble it up, even in a cage. They've got their eyes are sort of looking out for predators and things. So I think it's a good thing in recent times, I think we've gotten a lot better at recognizing that we're animals as well, and we're basically hardwired to worry and to fret and to suffer. But we're also got the opposite as well, to dream and aspire to greater things and have good humor and a good time with people as well. So it's we might move on. Oh yeah, sorry, I had to tell you. Sorry, I forgot. I did see. I saw a film I really liked called The Lighthouse.
Okay, I don't think I saw that.
Yeah. Well, so the story behind this was just when COVID was about to hit us properly. So I think it was about in Feb. The last time I travelled, I went over to Perth,
Yeah.
and then I got an invitation on the flight back saying, "Would you like to put a bid in for a business class seat?"
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And I basically got the invitation, and I selected the lowest possible value because I figured, well, I don't really want to pay for a business class
Yeah.
seat. So I don't know how much it was. It was very, very cheap. But shortly after that, I actually got it, and so I managed to fly back from Perth business class on a proper international flight.
Stretch out. Yeah, very nice.
Yeah, well, it was a proper business class seat, and I got dinner and a few drinks, and I sat back and I watched the lighthouse.
Yeah.
And when I got home, my wife, Christine, she said, "Oh, how are you feeling? You're tired?" And I said to her, "I just had the most relaxing time of my life." I got to completely de-stress and just sit back and watch it. I won't tell you exactly what the film was about, but like some of the twists and turns, but the basic premise behind it is it's set at a lighthouse, and there are two men running the lighthouse. There's the lighthouse captain and the other guy who's basically doing all the chores.
Okay.
And you follow those guys around. It's a psychological thriller. And what I think is really interesting now in hindsight is that it actually is also a film about lockdown or being locked down with one person for an extended period of time, and the sort of stresses that we were discussing just then, of being with just that one person and their personality and their habits, and also the concern and the worry about potentially being stuck there a lot longer or permanently. And so the film it's very much a psychological in nature, in that it looks at whether or not it looks at one character in particular, his suffering, and is it what he's seeing actually real? Is he imagining certain things? Is he being manipulated? It's quite an interesting one if you like a good psychological thriller. It's pretty intense.
It does sound good, especially at 35,000 feet, stretched out on a plane.
Oh yeah.
Have you noticed, like, in business class, the attitude to alcohol is completely different to economy? So, like, if you ask for like a second glass of wine with your dinner in economy, and the wine's not going to be as good, obviously, like, you often have to sort of like convince them to give it to you. They assume that you're like some kind of, wild thug who just can't be trusted with alcohol. But in business class, they just literally ply you with wine. Well, that's been my experience in business class anyway.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I don't think I've had enough experience in business class to develop a routine to know. But I look, definitely, the only other time I flew business class was with Christine, and when we sat down on the flight, they walked over and said, "What would you like to drink?" before we'd even got close to taking.
Yeah.
And we looked at each other and we just thought, wow, this is like the best thing ever. And I think you'd only think of it as the best thing ever in contrast to your normal flying experience.
Well, that's right. That's the problem. Yeah. And then, like, there's this saying that one of the most exquisite tortures you can administer is to give someone a little bit of luxury and then take it away from them again.
Yes.
So, like, if you've never flown business class, like, you don't really know what you're missing. But then if you fly once and then you go back to economy, and I've flown economy more than I've flown business, but I have flown business a number of times, and then you go back and do economy, and it's harder because you know what it's like up there.
It's certainly, let's face it, flying in general, the whole experience from end to end is torture. It's a horrible thing. You've got to get to the airport. You're usually tired. You haven't slept very well. You've got to park your car. You've got to go through that horrible security. You've got to line up holding all your stuff. You eat terrible food at the airport. The flying experience is the one thing I don't miss in all of this COVID-19. I could quite easily abandon it, except for, definitely business class is a luxury, and I would love it. That's the one thing I would love to do all the time if I could. It's funny. I think it was this could be one of those beat up sort of stories, but years ago, Johnny Depp apparently was, because he was going through financial trouble, and apparently his financial advisors were saying, well, one of our big expenses is your private jet, and so you could just fly first class instead. And he apparently went on this big rant saying, I'm not going to, so how could I fly first class? How could you put me through that? And
yeah. I read this profile of him a year or two ago, and he was really upset because it had been reported that he was spending $50,000 a month on wine.
Yes.
And I might be getting the figures wrong here, but he said it's at least $100,000 a month.
Yeah, that's right. I saw that.
And a lot of that was like, his wine consumption probably is, pretty impressive, but a lot of that was the vintages. He's like literally putting away like $10,000 bottles of wine. So that's going to add up.
Yeah, I imagine that exactly right. You're right. A little bit of luxury for us probably spoils us. But you can imagine for people who are like multimillionaires, who are just like off the chart, and they're literally drinking the most expensive things you can buy and eating the most expensive food. That would ruin you as well if you suddenly lost your fortune and you were right back to having, I guess, a $20 bottle of wine with dinner, which we'd probably enjoy, but you imagine they might take one sip and spit it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next one. Okay. This is a good one. What was the most controversial topic last year?
Ooh, that's a good question. Like, so I think here in Australia, it was really the restrictions and lockdown and people's attitudes towards that. But I'm particularly thinking of Victoria, even though I wasn't there. But that was what basically Dan Andrews. Like I'll put it straight out there. That's the controversy that I picked up on the most. I think internationally in the US, there's a huge controversy over masks, the use of masks. But then in Australia, that controversy I don't think was really there so much. And in Asia, I discussed before, I spent a lot of time over the years in Southeast Asia in particular, and that controversy wasn't there. So yeah, for me, what I picked up on was some things were really controversial in some places, not so controversial in others. But probably the one I focused on at home was around restrictions, Dan Andrews, I guess, policies around how he responded to the pandemic down there.
Yeah, look, I think overall, if we looked globally, I think generally there was a few controversial ones we could probably list. The top one would be lockdowns.
Yeah.
I think it has to be, because I think that was something that impacted everyone, at least to some degree or not. There was so much discussion around, did Sweden do the right thing in not locking down, or are they playing a longer game where they're thinking that this is going to drag on for years, so we might as well just find a way to operate without lockdowns, even though they've had I think they've put restrictions in place. I'm not sure if they've done any sort of lockdown. And it's interesting because it's very hard to compare all the different countries, because you look at, I'm not sure where Sweden sits at the moment. I know it's not low on the list, but I don't think it's in the top with the UK and the US as being one of the hardest hit. But then there's so many geographical factors and social factors that play into it. So it's not just your policy and strategy. Sometimes it's just luck. And I think we've had a lot of luck in Australia and New Zealand as well, just by the fact that we've got our borders are water and we're isolated. It takes a bit of effort to get to us.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, there's certainly, there's that, and there's also the fact that we're not nearly as dense as Europe or Africa or even the US.
Yeah, I think early on I had some vague expectation that there'd be a more unified global sort of response to it. So I remember early on people were sort of saying, well, what are the WHO doing? And, they did do various things and make various statements, but it became pretty clear pretty quickly that they weren't going to have a driving international policy role there. And I guess the way it's turned out, we probably shouldn't be that surprised. National governments are going to make national policy for different countries. But I've got this suspicion that if this had happened during the 1990s or even the early 2000s, I think there would have been a at least a bigger attempt at a global, like UN-led, unified sort of response to it somehow.
Yeah, I think you could almost make the case as well that President Trump was the most controversial thing last year.
Yeah.
And I think certainly towards the end of the year, because I think COVID was less in the media across the world, and when the election was occurring, that came about. But certainly, I think what's happening in the US right now has been such an extraordinary disruption that has occurred in last year. I mean, I can't think of any in my lifetime. I can't think of any point in history where they've had the intersection of the president and how, you know, a disruptor that he is, plus the COVID pandemic, plus the Black Lives Matter stuff that was going on there as well. I mean, absolutely extraordinary that all of these things. The only thing that could have topped it would have been if there was another world war, I would have thought, or there's nothing I can think of that's had as many deaths as well. I mean, we've sent people to war, but the death toll is much higher than that. And it's so whatever's happening. If you're in the US right now, I don't know if it would be very hard to untangle COVID from
it's
happening. Yeah,
you're right though. He is a huge figure of controversy, and I've heard like stories anecdotally to people I know in the US, and where there's been real divisions in family and social groups about it, like particularly in families, because you often tend to make friends with people that broadly share your political beliefs and assumptions. Not always, but families can be very different, as we know. So there are many cases where families have different political opinions, and usually it's very easy just to leave those on the sidelines and not sort of bring them up. There might be the occasional heated argument, or heated discussion, but I have heard these stories with like Thanksgiving and Christmas gatherings, that when one family member knows that another one sort of is signed up to the Trump agenda, they can't reconcile it with the person that they think they know, and they often with quite sad consequences, like people just avoid seeing each other, or they have a big argument about it. So that's he's a divisive person.
Yeah, well, I think it's certainly worthy of us. We're planning on doing a bit of after the whole when Trump leaves office, we'll do like a bit of an election retrospective election look at that, because I think that was fascinating, especially what was happening recently. I think certainly one of the things that's coming out loud and clear is much more than ever before. I think we've seen social media has just been fueling this divisiveness like never before. And those social media sites like Twitter and even Facebook, they're designed basically to feed you the same information over and over. So if you start looking up left-wing stuff or right-wing stuff, then the algorithm is designed to just keep adding more and more to that. So it shows you the same thing. It shows you things that align with your worldview. So so we're getting polarized. Everyone's getting really polarized, and I think there's an unfortunate thing like the one you mentioned. You've got families now where you could have people who are perhaps more moderate in the middle, but may lean a particular way, but people aren't allowed to lean anymore, because you're either with them or against them, as they say.
No, it's true. And we often, maybe not often, but sometimes we find out things about friends or family members and their political persuasions or whatever, or things they're sort of signed up to, so to speak, through social media. So it's not necessarily through having a discussion with them, but you see that they might have even liked something, or and you think, why did they like that? Why did they share that? And it's not really a healthy way to interact. Like, you're better off, if you want to have that conversation, having a conversation with them sort of directly, I suppose.
Absolutely, and a greater tolerance and discussion. That's always been the way. Even if your viewpoints diverge completely, then that's actually a good opportunity to talk to someone and try and understand, where they're coming from.
Yeah.
We're getting less of that, aren't we? We're getting much more reaction and less contemplation.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly on Twitter, actually. I use Twitter, but I try to use it in a fairly defined way now. And I've been on there, I think, since 2009. It's definitely a less nice place than it was in 2009. Like it's always had problems, but it seemed in 2009 or 2010, those early years, it seemed to be fairly collegial, like with people kind of sharing things they'd read and sharing ideas. And now you have sort of bot factories and all these sort of like, you know, and also there's bots of one thing, there's people on there who are just, you know, literally trolling, like they're hiding behind sort of, you know, anonymous handles and things like that, and literally like throwing grenades, you know, verbal grenades or sort of, you know, at people, and it's not a healthy place.
Yeah, well, that's right. And you wouldn't have thought that it would have so much influence because, like, I would have thought, like, a few years ago, someone would have said, "Oh, look, how to what extent do you think it influences things in our society?" And I would have gone, "Well, you see a lot of this social media stuff, but most of the people aren't really talking on that. Like, they're observing." But we've just seen recently with Trump being shut down off Twitter that actually he's lost. Like his platform basically, which is amazing. Like that was what he relied on. I mean, no other president ever thought to use Twitter the way he did. And
that's true. He revolutionized it absolutely by direct communication. So, you know, like he didn't spend anywhere near as much in 2016 on his campaign compared to Hillary Clinton, because he essentially, the media was talking about him all the time anyway, even if they weren't saying good things about him, they were just putting him on top of the agenda. And then he was using Twitter to directly communicate. And a lot of people, probably including me in the early days, kind of derided that because his communication didn't seem to be particularly, you know, eloquent or polished or anything like that. But it not only did it cut through, but it kind of spawned a movement.
Yeah, it's pretty. Yeah, it's fascinating, and also fascinating that someone, a man of his age as well, was so tech savvy. I don't want to be ageist, but generally speaking, like politicians and the people who come through and of his age group, and that I guess he's a baby boomer, isn't he?
Yeah, he's a boomer.
Treats. I've seen it. Treat social media in a much more conservative, conventional way. They will think about what they're going to say when they publish something. It's much more, and you know, if you go back through the Obama tweets or any of the other presidents, they're all very strategically designed, to not be too controversial. Whereas he was sitting there tapping away like he's like a Gen Y, you know. it's just
I mean, what I find interesting actually is how social media platforms have evolved in the last maybe 5 years, especially because I first remember Facebook when I was studying in the US, like in 2006, so like at an American university, and that I think Facebook was maybe 1-2 years old at that point, and it was still predominantly used as a social networking for universities. And I'm pretty sure I can remember people talking about it as the Facebook. And I was told that if you wanted to get invited to parties on campus, you had to go to this thing. So it was very much a young person's platform. And now, really, I think it's much older. Like it sort of predominantly seems to be, you know, maybe our parents' generation, maybe us to some extent. Younger people, they might have a page, but they know when they're on there, they're kind of interacting with their Aunt Mavis as much as they are with, like, you know, their mate from school. Whereas like they've got other things like, you know, Snapchat, especially, maybe Instagram to a lesser extent. I think they're probably expressing themselves more freely there. And then Twitter, there's a lot of bubbles within Twitter. So the way I find it, there's journalists interacting with journalists and people who follow them, and academics doing the same thing, and it's sort of plugging in to different bubbles. And you can definitely tailor an experience for yourself by just following people that you like or agree with if you want.
Yeah, to me, Twitter's like one big competition, of sides. It's like people trying to score points with the most cutting attack or witty comments that you can possibly get. And it's like some game that no one's really signed up for, but they're all playing. And and I think I don't really do much at all on Twitter, in part because I for that reason I think in order to get followers you've got to be take a few risks, and be interesting, but you also invite a lot of hostility, and it's a very tricky environment to navigate.
Oh, absolutely. It's just it's not worth the time, really.
No. And it's not a good experience. I don't think there's anyone on the planet who sits down and spends 10 minutes cycling through Twitter and walks away feeling like a better person at the end of it.
No, I mean, there's the old saying, no one on their deathbed said, "I wish I spent more time at the office." I can guarantee you, no one will die saying, "I wish I spent more time on Twitter."
Yeah, absolutely. I love that episode of The Simpsons where Mr. Burns on his deathbed pops his head up and says, I should have spent more time at work.
Yeah.
Now, just let's looking at the time. Let's do the last one. This a more upbeat one. What was the most welcome surprise of 2020? So, like a surprise that actually was a good thing.
Ooh, I don't know. Gosh, I was going to say that it ended, but I mean that wasn't a surprise. We knew it was going to end, and then we discovered that it ending didn't necessarily change all that much. Well, this is quite corny actually, but I think what I found was like living in the present can be quite good. So I was sort of like always looking ahead to the next thing I'm doing on the horizon, and planning and travel is sort of wrapped up in that. And we had some pretty big personal plans at the beginning of 2020 that, like a lot of people, got put on hold, and I was really annoyed about that to start with. And then I kind of realized, well, I can't do anything about it, so I can't plan what we're doing, in 3 months or even necessarily next month, but we can try and get the most out of what we're doing right now and really enjoy that. So that was a big part of 2020 for me, and it was quite good in that way.
Yeah. I think mine's a little bit similar, but I actually was more surprised that so much could still work and function with lockdowns. Like, was, and because when this first started, my first thought was, oh, gee, everything's gonna shut down. The economy is going to completely crash because everything is interconnected and nobody, like, it's just going to be a ghost town. But I was absolutely pleasantly surprised to see how amazing that so many things could be run offline and still function, and people still were interested in working and being productive.
Yeah.
I thought that was a nice thing to know, because in the worst case scenario, which, having lived in Victoria, we will probably experienced the harshest lockdown you could have, and that we will ever have, unless, of course, we're hit with a virus that's a lot worse. But at least in our lifetime, or at least with COVID around, we've probably experienced the worst of it, and the worst of it wasn't terrible. At least I can say that, and I'm fortunate that I got to keep working, so I can't speak for. Yeah, that goes without saying.
Perspectives, I get, and I preface what I say with that as well.
Yeah, it could have been a lot worse. It could have been much, much worse, and it certainly is in other parts of the world. But I'm actually amazed, like, so many things continue to work. You could wake up in the morning, your electricity is still on, you've still got internet, you still can get food, and everyone was worried. They were rushing to the supermarkets and buying everything because they thought everything's just going to dry up, but it didn't. Right. The system was at least resilient enough. Like, we complain a lot about not being prepared and being so vulnerable, but it's pretty remarkable how quickly the whole world adapted being unprepared as well, isn't it? Like, that's so many things that they were able to shift gears so quickly and generate a vaccine as quickly as, even if it's not 100% effective, it's pretty remarkable that we could do that, something like that.
Yeah, I think so. I'd probably throw in, like, the whole working from home thing, for the people who did do that, and even online learning. I know there's been some criticism of that, but in general, I think the way they sort of managed to flick a switch pretty quickly has been really impressive. And, like, I've been as annoyed by endless Zoom meetings and all that sort of thing as the next person, but I think in general, I guess what maybe was a bit of a surprise, I guess we knew the technology was there, but we were underutilizing it before, and then we kind of realized it was there and we could take it up in a really big way. That was probably a surprise to me.
Yeah, I did, definitely. And I think, even to this podcast, like, we discussed doing this for a while, and then in many ways, I think the lockdown actually forced us to do it, because we were like, we discovered, well, Zoom is not just convenient, but it also records and does all of this stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
So why not? And we don't have to sort of fit in our schedules to meet up and set up like a little studio and talk.
Yeah.
We can do this, and we can talk to our guests. They don't have to come in either. And
Yeah.
So I'm actually a little bit surprised that I didn't take on board some of this technology a lot faster as well. Like in hindsight, I'm like, well, there's so many things that I sat back and I remember talking about Zoom early 2020.
Yeah.
Before the pandemic, someone said, "Oh, why don't you Zoom me?" And I was like, "What's Zoom?"
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd never used any of that online stuff, and they were absolutely astounded that I'd never heard of it before. Whereas I think they'd be even more astounded if I said it today.
I had a similar situation. Like, I think the limit, I'd been using it a little bit for some people overseas, and that was about it. And then at the beginning, my concern was, because a lot of the work I do is kind of, based on relationships with people and organizations. And I thought, I'm not sure that we'll be able to manage that in the same way, on a virtual platform than we can by meeting people face to face and even flying to another city, to spend some time with them. And I think because everybody was doing it, that made it really different. So it wasn't like you were suggesting, hey, let's do it this way rather than catch up face to face, because they literally couldn't do that. Yeah. So that whole sort of, everyone was just on the same playing field in that way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It was removing because it was a necessity, you weren't basically implying, I can't be bothered to come in and meet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You remove that as a possibility, but now I think it's really great in that people have this little option. So it's kind of like, oh, we could just have a chat online or catch up, and that's it. You're not living in a part of the world that's got restrictions at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was a good wrap up, I think, of 2020. It's kind of good in a way, and also a little bit unfortunate that it was so overshadowed by one thing that's basically what we focused our attention on. But there was really no other way around it, was there? It was.
That's right.
It was always going to be about that.
Yeah.
About the experience we had last year, and certainly we're to your point, we're still in it, and we're still pushing our way through it. But I still think we're better off than where we were in March last year, even though the path forward is a lot clearer. Well, not a lot clearer, but a little bit more optimistic than it was in March, when it was certainly we were staring down the barrel of something very uncertain and terrifying.
Yeah, I think we have more answers than we did in March last year. I mean, we probably also have more questions, but we know there was that period of great uncertainty, and there's still a lot more we need to know. But yeah, I agree. I think we're in a better position now than we were then.
So next week we're catching up with Simon Moss, and we're going to be discussing the future again. So we're going to talk about, this time we're going to talk about goal setting in 2021. So what enables someone to sit down, make a goal, actually stick to it.
Yeah.
Build in some new habits. It's usually the time of the year everyone wants to do that.
Are we going to talk about New Year's resolutions, or can New Year's resolutions be a positive thing to set you up for goals? Yeah, that's worth talking about, I think.
Yes, yeah, indeed. We can talk about that, and we'll hopefully from Simon we'll get some tips on how we can make some improvements, and we can discuss whether whether both of us have come up with any New Year's resolutions.
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's say sayonara to 2020.
Yes.
And we're almost into February, so we'll be in December before we know it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Catch you later.